Frank Sinatra was halfway through Fly Me to the Moon when he saw the gun. Not pointed at him, not yet, just resting on the table in front of a man in the front row. A man whose name you whispered in Las Vegas never spoke out loud. Frank stopped singing. The band kept playing. The audience held its breath. And then Frank Sinatra did something that would either make him immortal or get him killed. He walked straight toward the mobster and looked him dead in the eyes. What happened next became the most legendary moment in Las Vegas history. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Las Vegas in 1963. It was not the family-friendly tourist destination it is today. It was a city owned and operated by organized crime. The casinos, the hotels, the shows, everything ran through the mob, and everyone knew it. The Sands Hotel, where Frank Sinatra performed regularly, was partially owned by crime families from Chicago and New York. The entertainment industry and the underworld were so intertwined that separating them was impossible. You performed, you entertained, you kept your mouth shut, and you never ever crossed the men who really ran the town. Frank Sinatra understood this better than anyone. He had grown up in Hoboken, New Jersey, a place where organized crime was just part of the landscape. His uncle had connections to the Genovese family. His mother, Dolly, operated in political circles that overlapped with men whose business interests extended beyond legitimate enterprise. Young Frank learned early that success in the nightclub business required accommodation with certain powerful interests. He knew these men. He knew how they thought. He knew what they were capable of. And he knew that in Las Vegas, you survived by knowing your place. But Frank Sinatra also had something that most people did not have. He had a complete refusal to bow to anyone. On stage, Frank was untouchable, not because he was arrogant, but because he genuinely believed he had earned his position through talent and determination. He was there to sing, to entertain, to give audiences something magical. If you did not like it, that was your problem. This attitude had served him well throughout his career. He had survived career collapses, romantic scandals, and political controversies. He had won Academy Awards and sold millions of records. He was the chairman of the board, the voice, the most famous entertainer in America. But on September 14th, 1963, that confidence would be tested in a way that nobody could have predicted. The trouble started 2 weeks earlier. Frank was in his dressing room at the Sands preparing for his evening show when there was a knock at the door. His assistant opened it. Standing in the hallway was a man in an expensive suit. Frank recognized the type immediately. The man said that Mr. Giancana would like to speak with him after his show tonight, in private. Frank looked up from the newspaper he was reading. He told the messenger that he was pretty tired after shows these days and that maybe another time would work better. The man's expression did not change. He said that Mr. Giancana insists. Sam Giancana was not just connected to organized crime. He was the boss of the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful crime organizations in America. He controlled gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering across the Midwest. He had connections to politicians, movie stars, and even the Kennedy administration. When Sam Giancana wanted to meet with you, you met with him, period. But Frank stood up and walked over to the door. He looked the messenger directly in the eyes. He told him that Frank Sinatra does not take meetings with people who send messengers. If Sam wants to talk to him, he can come to his dressing room himself and ask nicely. The messenger stared at Frank for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and said he would deliver the message. After he left, Frank's assistant was visibly shaken. He asked Frank if he knew who that was, if he understood that he could not just blow off Sam Giancana like that. Frank shrugged and went back to his newspaper. He said he could, and he did. He reminded everyone that he did not work for the mob. He worked for the Sands. And last he checked, he was the one selling out shows here, not Sam Giancana. His people tried to explain the danger. Giancana was not a man who accepted refusal gracefully. He had a reputation for violence that made other mobsters uncomfortable. The next night, September 5th, Frank performed his usual show. Afterwards, the same messenger appeared at his dressing room. He said that Mr. Giancana is waiting downstairs and would like to speak with him now. Frank was taking off his bow tie. He told the messenger to tell Sam that he already left for the night. The messenger pointed out that Frank was right here. Frank smiled and said he could have sworn he left 10 minutes ago. The messenger's jaw tightened. He said that Frank did not understand. Frank interrupted him. He said he understood perfectly. He understood that he just worked his ass off for 2 hours entertaining people, that he was tired, and that he was going to his room to have a drink and go to sleep. Frank told the messenger he could stand there and argue or deliver the message. The choice was his. The messenger left without another word. Frank's manager was beside himself. He told Frank that he was going to get himself killed, that he needed to talk to Dean, that Dean knew these guys and could smooth this over. But Frank refused. He said he was not getting Dean involved in this, and he was not meeting with some boss who thinks he can snap his fingers and Frank will come running. He reminded everyone that he was Frank Sinatra. He did not run for anybody. His pride was legendary, but this time it might get him killed. On September 13th, the day before the incident, word started spreading around the sands that Sam Giancana was furious, very furious. Casino staff who worked with the mob quietly warned Frank's people that he needed to make peace, but Frank still refused to meet. That evening, his manager came to his dressing room, begging him to just take the meeting. 5 minutes, that was all. Frank asked what Giancana wanted. His manager hesitated. He said he was not sure, but he heard it had something to do with some business arrangement, something about the Calneva Lodge that Frank partly owned. Apparently, there were questions about certain guests who had visited the resort. Frank laughed. He said that was his business, not Giancana's. His manager said it did not matter what the issue really was. What mattered was that Giancana believed there was a problem, and that was all that mattered. He begged Frank to just meet with him, apologize, tell him whatever he wanted to hear. But Frank was stubborn. He said he was not apologizing for running his own business. If Sam Giancana had a problem with him, he could bring it up like a man, not through messengers and threats. His manager left shaking his head, knowing that once Frank's mind was made up, there was no changing it. And he also knew that this situation was about to get very dangerous. September 14th, 1963, the day everything came to a head. Frank arrived at the Sands around 6 in the evening for his 9 o'clock show. The atmosphere in the hotel was tense. Staff members were whispering. Security seemed more alert than usual. Something was happening, but nobody would say what. At 8:30, his assistant came to his dressing room, looking terrified. He told Frank that he needed to cancel tonight's show. Frank asked why he would do that. His assistant explained that Sam Giancana had bought out the first 3 rows, him and about 15 of his guys. They were out there right now, waiting. Frank did not even look up from adjusting his bow tie in the mirror. He pointed out that they paid for tickets, which made them audience members like anybody else. His assistant said this was not a joke. They were not there to watch him sing. They were there to send a message. Frank finished with his tie and turned to face his assistant. He said he guessed he better put on a good show then. At 9 o'clock, Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage of the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel. The room was packed with 1,600 people. The atmosphere was electric, but not in the usual way. There was tension in the air. People could sense that something was off. Frank looked out at the audience and immediately saw them. The first 3 rows filled with men in dark suits. And in the center of the front row, directly in front of the stage, sat Sam Giancana himself. He was a compact man, maybe 5'7", with cold eyes that had seen things most people could not imagine. He was staring directly at Frank Sinatra. Frank smiled at the audience. He welcomed them to the Sands and promised a great show. He said he was going to sing some songs, tell some jokes, and hopefully they would all have a wonderful time. He nodded to the band and they started playing. Frank sang, moving around the stage with his usual casual elegance, but his eyes kept drifting back to Sam Giancana. The mob boss was not clapping, was not smiling, just sitting there staring. Frank finished the first song, and the audience applauded enthusiastically. Except for the first 3 rows, they sat in silence. Frank thanked the audience for their kindness. Then he said he noticed some of the folks in the front rows there seemed a little quiet. He told them not to worry. He would not take it personally. He knew it was hard to clap when your hands were busy. A few people in the audience laughed nervously. The men in the front rows did not react. Frank moved into his next song, Fly Me to the Moon. About halfway through, Sam Giancana reached into his jacket. Frank saw the movement, and his voice faltered for just a second. But Giancana was not pulling out a gun to fire. He was pulling out a pistol and placing it deliberately on the table in front of him. The weapon sat there, gleaming under the stage lights, visible to everyone nearby. Then Giancana did something that made the entire room uncomfortable. He made a gesture. A simple gesture, but one that was unmistakable. He drew his fingers slowly across his throat. Frank saw it. The band saw it. People in the nearby tables saw it. A murmur went through the crowd. Frank stopped singing. The band continued for a few more bars before trailing off into silence. Frank stood at center stage, looking directly at Sam Giancana. The room was completely silent, 1,600 people holding their breath. And then Frank did something that nobody expected. He smiled. He told the crowd they were going to take a little break from the planned program. He said there was a gentleman in the front row who seemed to have something he wanted to express. And Frank being Frank, he was all about giving people a chance to express themselves. He started walking toward the front of the stage. The audience tensed. Sam Giancana sat perfectly still, but his eyes narrowed. Frank reached the edge of the stage and looked down at the mob boss. He said he noticed Giancana had been sitting there making gestures at him all night. He was not sure if he was trying to tell him something or if he was just practicing his sign language, but either way, it was a little distracting. The room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Frank continued. He said, here was what he was thinking. If Giancana had something to say, why did he not come up here and say it? In fact, Frank knelt down at the edge of the stage and extended the microphone toward Sam Giancana. He asked why he did not come up here and sing. He said Giancana seemed like he might have a nice voice. What did he say? Sam Giancana stared at Frank for a long moment. His face was expressionless, but everyone who knew him knew that this was the most dangerous moment. This was when Sam Giancana decided whether to kill you or not. The gun sat on the table in front of him, within easy reach. His men waited for a signal. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The entire room waited to see what would happen, and then something incredible occurred. Sam Giancana started to laugh. It was not a friendly laugh. It was a cold, calculating laugh. But it was a laugh. He looked at Frank Sinatra, kneeling there with the microphone, fearless and slightly amused, and he laughed. He said Frank had balls and he would give him that. Frank smiled and asked if that was a yes on the singing. He warned that the acoustics up here were pretty good, so his voice better be ready. Giancana shook his head, still smiling that cold smile. He said Frank should keep singing. That was what he was good at. Frank stood back up and said he was sure. He said the offer stands. Anytime Giancana wanted to come up here and take over, he should just let him know. Giancana said he was sure. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Frank should keep doing his thing. He was all right. Frank nodded and walked back to center stage. He picked up the microphone stand and told the audience that it looked like he was going to have to finish this show himself after all. But before they continued, he suggested a round of applause for his friend in the front row. He called him a tough critic, but a fair one. The audience, still not entirely sure what was happening, applauded nervously. Sam Giancana raised his glass in a mock toast. The gun disappeared back into his jacket. Frank launched back into his performance. For the next hour, he sang and joked as if nothing had happened. Sam Giancana and his men stayed for the entire show. And when it was over, they stood and applauded, along with everyone else. After the show, Frank was in his dressing room when there was a knock at the door. His assistant opened it, and Sam Giancana was standing there, alone this time. He asked if he could come in. Frank nodded and offered him a drink. Giancana walked in and closed the door behind him. He said he would take a scotch if Frank had it. Frank poured 2 glasses and handed one to the mob boss. They stood there for a moment, not saying anything. Finally, Giancana spoke. He asked if Frank knew why he wanted to meet with him. Frank said he heard something about the Cal Neva. Giancana nodded. He said there were some people in Washington asking questions about who had been visiting the resort. He thought maybe Frank had been talking too much. Frank said he did not talk to anybody about anything. Giancana studied him for a moment. He said he knew that now. He had checked. Turns out someone else had been running their mouth. It was already taken care of. Frank did not ask what taken care of meant. He did not want to know. Giancana took a sip of his scotch. He said the thing was, he sent his guy to talk to Frank 3 times. Frank blew him off every time. That made him look bad in front of his people. He could not have that. Frank asked if that was why he came to his show. To scare him? Giancana smiled and said something like that. Then he noted that Frank did not scare. Did he? Frank said he did not scare easy. Giancana finished his drink and set the glass down. He said, here was the thing. He respected what Frank did tonight. Most guys would have pissed themselves if he did that throat-cutting thing with the gun on the table. But Frank walked right up to him and handed him a microphone. He said that took guts. Frank said it might have been guts, or it might have been stupidity. Maybe both. Giancana extended his hand and said they were good. Frank and him. Frank did not do anything wrong, and he respected a guy who stood his ground. Frank shook his hand and said he appreciated it. Giancana headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. He told Frank that next time he sent someone to talk to him, maybe he should not make them come 3 times. Frank agreed. Deal. And just like that, it was over. Sam Giancana left, and Frank Sinatra had survived what could have been the most dangerous night of his life. But the story did not end there. What happened that night at the Sands spread through Las Vegas like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in the entertainment business knew about it. Frank Sinatra had stood up to Sam Giancana, and not only had he survived, he had earned the mob boss's respect. The incident changed something fundamental about how the underworld viewed entertainers in Las Vegas. Before that night, performers were considered employees, expendable talent that could be replaced. But Frank had shown that a performer with enough courage and charisma could command respect even from the most dangerous men in the city. Dean Martin heard about what happened and called Frank the next day. He asked if Frank was out of his mind. He asked if Frank knew what Giancana could have done to him. Frank said Giancana could have done a lot of things, but he did not. Dean asked why Frank did it. Why did he not just meet with him when he asked? Frank thought about it for a moment. He said because if he had gone running the first time Giancana snapped his fingers, he would have been running for the rest of his life. These guys respect strength. Dean knew that. If you show weakness, they own you. So he did not show weakness. Dean was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed and called Frank a crazy bastard. He said Frank was either the bravest guy he knew or the dumbest. He could not decide which. Frank said maybe both. Over the years, the story of that night at the Sands grew into legend. Different people told different versions. Some said Frank had grabbed the gun off the table himself. Others said Giancana had actually come on stage and tried to fight him. None of those versions were true, but they spoke to how the incident had captured people's imaginations. The truth was simpler, but in some ways more impressive. Frank Sinatra had faced down one of the most powerful mob bosses in America with nothing but his charisma and his courage. He had refused to be intimidated, and in doing so he had secured his place as one of the true legends of Las Vegas. Sam Giancana and Frank Sinatra maintained a complicated relationship after that night. They would occasionally see each other at restaurants or casinos and would nod in acknowledgement. Giancana even came to a few more of Frank's shows over the years, always sitting in the front row, always applauding enthusiastically. The gun never appeared on the table again. In 1975, Sam Giancana was shot and killed in his basement in Oak Park, Illinois. It was a mob hit, the result of some internal power struggle that Frank knew nothing about and wanted to know nothing about. But when he heard the news, Frank was quoted as saying that Sam was a tough guy, but he was a fair guy. In his own way, he was a man of honor. Years later, when Frank was asked about that night in September 1963, he always downplayed it. He would say that people made too much of it. He just did not want some guy in the front row ruining his show. So he addressed it. That was all. But those who were there that night knew better. They had seen something rare. A moment when courage and composure in the face of genuine danger turned a potentially deadly situation into something else entirely. A moment of mutual respect between two men from completely different worlds. Frank Sinatra built his entire career on appearing cool and unflappable. But that night at the Sands, it was not an act. He really was that cool. He really was that unflappable. And he really was that brave. The microphone he offered to Sam Giancana that night at the Sands became a symbol of something larger. It was Frank's way of saying that, if you want to be in charge, fine, take over. But until you do, I am running this show. And Sam Giancana, one of the most dangerous men in America, had recognized that courage and respected it. That is the real story of the night a mafia boss threatened Frank Sinatra on stage. No gunfight, no dramatic escape. Just one man refusing to be intimidated and another man respecting him for it. In the end, that is what made Frank Sinatra a legend. Not just his talent, not just his charisma, but his absolute refusal to bow to anyone, no matter how powerful or dangerous they were. Frank Sinatra was the chairman of the board, and on September 14, 1963, he proved exactly why he deserved that title.